A reading from a remarkable poetry collection by our own Julie Cadwallader-Staub, Luminous. If light traveled only in lines, not also in waves, each rising band of world would have its brief and blasting hour of sun before rotating into darkness again. If love traveled only in lines, not also in waves, what child could withstand the impact of a parent's love? What spouse could survive that week or month or year of longing for another? What believer could summon sufficient courage to bow her head and pray if love traveled only in lines? No. We have evolved along with the natural world for waves. So when we are struck with a straight line, Jesus, for example, or death, almost everything in us seeks to silence this intruder, who alone stands impervious to our world of curve and compromise. But something deeper whispers, don't crucify this stranger. You could not perceive waves without a straight line. In its bright blast of truth, see what it illuminates. Here ends the reading. God, be present in this time that my words and all our meditations might be pleasing in your sight, but restorative in ours. Amen. He was 29 when he joined. He was the son of a postman and a seamstress. He failed to graduate high school when his mother fell ill. Then he was a sailor for many years until he was captured at the outbreak of a war and held prisoner for 5 years. Some say it was there that his heart was hardened, but others say it always had been. When released, he worked as a locksmith until he joined the Nazi Party at the age of 29, married his love Elizabeth at the age of 30, and had 10 children. He started a labor paper. He rose to become a regional governor, then the commissioner of defense for the Third Reich, and eventually the labor chief. During the war, the need for laborers was so intense that he imported almost 5 million workers from occupied territories, mostly Eastern Europe. Only 200,000 came voluntarily. Writing of his work with the Nuremberg prisoners, the chaplain Reverend Henry Gurecki said that he would often go to Sauckel's room where he would weep openly and abundantly, asking repeatedly if there might be a way for him to receive communion. Kneeling before his cot in prayer, he would ask how he had gotten here, insisting that it had all started for him from a desire to create an ideal social community, that he was following orders. His immediate superior, received 20 years in prison because forced labor was only one of his various responsibilities. Sauckel, for whom labor was his only job, received the death penalty. And he was so unnerved, Gurecki wrote, that I feared he would crack up. He would pray aloud, invariably ending our sessions with, "God be merciful to me, a sinner. God be merciful to me, a sinner," over and over and over. So when we are struck with a straight line, Jesus, for example, or death, almost everything in us seeks to silence this intruder who alone stands impervious to our world of curve and compromise. Have you come to destroy us? The demon calls out. Von Ribbentrop, a former ambassador and later head of foreign affairs for the Third Reich, was a climber, described often as only wanting to be at the top. He has been described by historians as the only Nazis that all the other Nazis hated. Goebbels, however you say that, wrote in his diary of his disgust. Von Ribbentrop, he wrote, bought his name, married his money, and swindled his way into office. Another diplomat noted that he acquired the habit of listening carefully to what Hitler was saying, memorized Hitler's pet ideas, and then presented Hitler's ideas as his own, which was a practice that much impressed Hitler, as proving that Ribbentrop was an ideal Nazi diplomat. He quickly learned that Hitler always favored the most radical solution to any problem and accordingly tendered his advice in that direction. Reverend Gorecki writes that in his career, he met many whose conversions were suspect, including many there at the trials. But not these, he writes. These were like Paul struck blind by light until they understood. Ribbentrop, he writes, spent his days in jail reading his Bible for the first time, cover to cover, and again. Perhaps he was a sycophant to the core, looking to please the person up top. Even Gorecki writes this, but in the end, the person up top for him was God. Gorecki noted von Ribbentrop was full of questions from the first, particularly about the relationship between patriotism and faith. And at the last, as he went up the steps, hands bound, then feet, his final words were, God, have mercy on my soul. I wish peace to the world. And then immediately, before the hood was placed over his head, he turned to Gorecki and whispered, I'll see you again. Melita Mashman, in her memoir, Account Rendered, taking the form of a letter to her Jewish childhood friend, writes step by step of her involvement in Hitler Youth and further up as she went. She was trying to understand her involvement in something so horrible. It is by most accounts difficult to read, in part because of its self-justifying tones and in part because of its utter banality. But there is one part that interests me. When she writes of her time in an American internment camp, speaking of being shown the photos of the concentration camps, she said that almost everyone there simply couldn't believe the photos. They were exaggerations. They had to be. Now, this reminded me of a conversation I had with a family member on January 6, 2021. They simply could not believe the insurrection was real. It was too easy. It must have been a plot to frame Trump. Yesterday, of course, was Holocaust Remembrance Day. Few survivors remain anymore, and the memory appears to be growing more distant. A headline from the papers yesterday speaks of this reality. One hope from changes at this Holocaust museum, fewer Nazi selfies. Now, long before Israel's horrifying attacks on Gaza, in the immediate hours after the attack, in church, I was approached by a faithful Christian individual who repeated the Hamas slogans and asked me to sign petitions for Palestine. In other words, I was asked to see the death of these Jewish people as the right moment to sign with their executioners. Hamas, you'll remember, is internationally known as a terrorist organization, and it has in its charter the belief that peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the movement, and cites the anti-Jewish tropes of Jewish monetary control of the world's elite and media. Neighboring Muslim countries are wary of admitting Palestinians, saying it would risk bringing militants into the peninsula. Do not in any way take this as indicative of my stance on Israel and Palestine. It is not. Simply that as early as October 8th, hours after the attack, which killed thousands, including pro-Palestinian peace activists, as soon as the next morning, well-intentioned individuals approached me with hopes that I would take up the cause, while texts from friends were frantically wondering if their family was alive. Swastikas, as you may know, have begun appearing again in Burlington. And there are reports from middle schoolers at Temple Sinai that a few children, a month and a half ago, led a chant against them in the cafeteria. Can you guess the chant? It was a small group. Gas the Jews. In her commentary on this passage from Mark, Reverend Meyer Bolton writes that any number of death-dealing forces today are often experienced as possession or being caught up in dynamics that far exceed our intentions or control. Think of how addiction overwhelms individuals and families, how racism and white supremacy shapeshift over time, how anger consumes, how envy devours, or how all of us, even against our will, are complicit in creating the blanket of pollution overheating the planet. We may or may not call addiction or racism or sexual objectification of women demons, but they are certainly demonic. They move through the world as though by a kind of cunning. They resist and sidestep and co-opt our best attempts to overcome them. And as we make those attempts, the experience can be less like figuring out a puzzle and more like wrestling with a beast. This is not an antiquated passage. It is from a different cultural perspective, yes. But it speaks to the power of the gospel, like a laser cutting through the things that bind us in order to free us. Each of us, each and every one of us, is pulled by forces outside of our control. And when they hear this call, right, this call of truth, those forces, they snap and they snarl. My anger is justified. My position is righteous. You couldn't possibly understand. I know who you are. Have you come to destroy us? Go ahead and try. We slam doors, we make quick exits. When we are hurt or feel abandoned, we fail to show up entirely, or we show up in ways that we are not proud of. We make demands and assume that we are right or that we know best. And if we don't snap or snarl it out, we drink it away. We silo ourselves into relationships that reinforce the idea that we are right and what we are seeing could not possibly be true. We are not immune to these demons, however you understand them. So when we are struck with a straight line, Julie says, Jesus, for example, or death, when everything in us wells up to cry out, have you come to destroy us? Well, don't crucify this stranger. You could not perceive waves without a straight line. In its bright blast of truth, friends, see what it illuminates. You might just be surprised. And you might just be set free. Thanks be to God.